Good evening. My name is Tony Towns, and I'm the 51st president of the Washington Bar Association. On behalf of our board of directors and our membership, I welcome you. Tonight's discussion was planned by the WBA's Knowledge is Power Committee, along with the Young Lawyers Division from both the Washington Bar and the National Bar Association. So to all the planners of the events, I thank you for your vision, your hard work, and dedication to the success of this panel discussion. To the panelists, thank you all in advance for your participation tonight. The Washington Bar Association proudly holds the distinction of being the oldest affiliate of the National Bar Association, both created in 1925 to empower African American lawyers. Since its inception, the Washington Bar Association and the NBA have played a key leadership role in ensuring equal justice under the law. In that same historic tradition, we come together tonight in partnership to provoke conversation, to inspire leadership, and to create positive change. Thank you, and I hope you enjoy the panel.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Alexandra Cohen, and I'm currently the chair of the Washington Bar Association Young Lawyers Division. I'm extremely excited to co-host this three-part series with my colleagues from the Washington Bar Association and the National Bar Association Young Lawyers Division surrounding this discussion on defunding the police. It is well known that police brutality is woven into the fabric of the Black experience. And now it seems that we've come to an impasse where we've been forced to have conversations that are considered controversial, like defunding the police. My hope is that the participants joining in tonight's discussion will find themselves informed as the panelists dissect and explore what it really means to defund the police. Thank you.
My name is Onika Williams, and I am chair of the National Bar Association Young Lawyers Division. NBA YLD is honored and thankful for the invitation from the Washington Bar Association, WBA President Tony Towns, the WBA Young Lawyers Division, and WBA YLD Chair Alexandra Cohen to participate in tonight's event. We believe that this series will be important, informational, and timely in light of all that is going on, current and historical events. We look forward to tonight's discussion.
My name is Deanna Maria Lewis, and it is my pleasure and honor to serve as this year's Vice President of the Washington Bar Association. It is also my honor to serve as the Knowledge is Power co-chair for this bar year. And it is my distinct pleasure to introduce tonight's moderator, many of whom know she needs no introduction, Mrs. Nicole Austin Hillary. Mrs. Nicole Austin Hillary is a well-known civil rights advocate and community leader. She is the current executive director of the U.S. program at Human Rights Watch, and she leads the Human Rights Watch's efforts to end violations in abusive systems within the United States. Her work focuses on addressing and combating systemic racism, improving the U.S. immigration system, tackling rights problems within the domestic criminal justice system, and advocating for policies to address poverty and inequality informed by the international human rights standards. Prior to joining Human Rights Watch, Ms. Austin Hillary was the first director and counsel of the Brennan Center's Washington, D.C. office, which she opened in March of 2008. She has also previously litigated at the law firm of Mary and Scallett, PLLC, as part of the firm's Civil Rights Employment Class Action Practice, and she was the George N. Lindsay Civil Rights Law Fellow at the National Office of the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under the Law in Washington, D.C., where she focused on housing litigation and policy. What is very near and dear to all of our hearts, I'm sure, she also served as the 2018 and 2019 president of the Washington Bar Association. She is also a past president and current board member of the Washington Council of Lawyers, formerly served as an advisory committee member of the ABA Standing Committee on Election Law. She served on the board of Common Cause and is a former co-chair of the ABA Criminal Justice Section's Defense Function Committee. Ms. Austin Hillary has been an adjunct civil rights professor at the University of the District of Columbia, David A. Clark School of Law, and is a former Wasserstein Public Interest Fellow at Harvard Law School. Many of you will be very excited to hear that Ms. Austin Hillary is also a graduate of the Howard University School of Law, as well as Carnegie Mellon University. I now introduce you to Ms. Nicole Austin Hillary.
Thank you so much, Deanna. I feel like I owe you a check. For that, I'm like, who is that? It is so good to be here this evening. And as you said, one of the things I'm most proud of is having served as a past president of the Washington Bar Association. And one of the reasons I'm so proud of that is for conversations like we are about to embark upon tonight. The WBA stands up and stands out when we have issues of concern to our nation. So I am so pleased that tonight's discussion on defunding policing will serve as the first of a three-part series that the Knowledge is Power division of the WBA is taking on to ensure that we're engaging in the conversations that we need to be having in our communities. And I want to remind everyone, this is not just a conversation. I actually don't like when we just sit around and talk about the problems. We want to be talking about concretized solutions. And the panelists that are joining me this evening are some of the foremost experts on how we can devise solutions to the problems that we are facing around policing. Now, I want to make sure that we speak truth to power in tonight's discussion. So we're going to get real, and we're going to keep it real, because if we're not having those kinds of conversations here within the WBA, then where will we have them? So with that, I'm going to quickly introduce our panelists, and then we're going to get down to the business of tonight's discussion. First, I would like to introduce Council Member Robert White, who is an at-large member of the Council of the District of Columbia and is chair of the Metropolitan Washington Council of Governments Board of Directors. He is also chair of the Committee on Facilities and Procurement. In the community, Robert works hard as an advocate for strong communities and efficient government. This is why he is a public servant. He founded the Brightwood Park Citizens Association to unite and energize his neighborhood. And we're going to hear more from the council member about what his role is and really what the role is of our government leaders at this critical moment in our history. Next, we have Vendetta Parker. She began her law enforcement career with the Metropolitan Police Department in Washington, D.C. at the tender age of 17. We're gonna have to figure out how you did that. You must be one of those, geniuses. And she worked her way through the ranks from police cadet to commander. She has been assigned to all 7 patrol districts in various capacities, as well as the Criminal Investigations Division within the FBI. She is now retired from the Metropolitan Police Department and is presently employed by the federal government. And I want to thank you particularly, Ms. Parker, for being here, because certainly if we are talking about the police, having served as a member of one of the nation's highest police forces, it really is important that you be part of this conversation. So thank you very much for being here. Next, we have Martinez Jackson. Martinez began his legal career as a junior associate at Deborah Boyce and Plimpton, LLP's litigation department, before serving as a prosecutor in the District of Columbia. His book, entitled Justice My Way, Memoirs of a Black Prosecutor, memorializes his experience serving in that role. And we know, we'll get into this, because we know that the role of Black prosecutors is critically important as we talk about reforming the justice system. He currently owns and operates Jackson Legal Services, PLLC, and his firm focuses on criminal defense, personal injury, and police misconduct cases. Thank you, Martinez, for being with us this evening. And last but certainly not least, Paige Fernandez is the Policing Policy Advisor in the ACLU's National Political Advocacy Department. She develops and implements comprehensive strategies that advance the ACLU's affirmative vision for reducing the role, power, presence, and responsibilities of the police in U.S. communities. She also develops and leads nationwide advocacy around police practices. So clearly the work that you are doing right now, Paige, in terms of putting together the reform agenda is critical to this conversation. So let's get started. I'm going to ask this question, and this has been asked of me, like all of you. I'm having lots of these conversations. People want to know, and I get this all the time, are you really saying that you want to defund the police? Are you really saying in this moment that you want to do away with any kind of organized system of maintaining law and order in this nation? And I think we have to start with this question, because I think there's a lot of confusion around it. And I think it's important that people know what the foundational issues are when the conversation is defunding or shifting investment in policing. So I'm going to start with you, Paige, as an advocate who works on policy. What do we really mean when we talk about defunding police?
Thanks. So I think it's important to first say that, the dynamics around language differ across the country. And it's important that we listen to local advocates and organizers to understand their goals when they talk about defunding or divestment. But I think there's two distinct phrases that are being thrown out there. There's defunding and divestment. And in principle, they are both the same. But the phrase defund the police was created by Black-led organizations that treat defunding as a step along the way to the complete abolition of police. So abolitionists like Miriam Kaba and Andrea Ritchie say defunding the police is a strategy to advance a long-term vision of abolition of police, from policing as a practice, dismantling policing institutions, and building community-based responses. And I think the term abolition has been defined by abolitionists as a presence of justice and freedom and the absence of harm and punitive systems. For the ACLU, we don't use the term defunding. We use the term divestment to really respect the abolitionist movement and not water down their work. We are not an abolitionist organization. And what we're referring to when we talk about divestment and reinvestment is a shift of power, funding, resources, and responsibility away from the institution of policing and into life-affirming, community-based and community-led services. The core of this is to divest from police and then reinvest in the communities that have suffered from underinvestment in everything except punitive programs for the past few decades.
Councilmember, following up on Paige's definition, you're a lawmaker. And you are obviously charged with helping to provide oversight for government services, for community needs. How does her definition that she shared, how does that strike you? How does that hit your ears as a legislator and a lawmaker?
I think Paige's description is exactly right. There are indeed some people who want to see no police force whatsoever. And then there are a number of other people who want to see a reduction in the size of police. What I think is really important to remember is that we've been trying to address the same systemic issues for decades now, using this kind of one tool that I think is not effective at addressing the underlying issues. So, crime goes up and people say, well, expand the size of the police department. And that's what we do year after year after year. But as long as you have such a magnitude of folks, especially in DC, almost exclusively Black and brown, who are unemployed, who have unstable housing, who have untreated mental health issues, you're going to continue to see crime no matter how much police you add. So if you have one pot of money, no matter how big or small that pot is, you have to start funding things other than the police force if you really do want to address the issue of crime. And that's a scary thought, because it's more of a long-term solution. It does take some time, but it is the only realistic way we push down crime and, frankly, reduce the incidence of violations against people of color. So do you need armed city employees with exclusive jurisdiction over traffic stops? No. Over with exclusive jurisdiction almost over, mental health issues, loitering, noise complaints? Absolutely not. So in the same way that we don't use police to enforce, let's say, building code violations, we shouldn't be overusing police to address a number of issues that we've relied on them for over the years.
And let me ask you a quick follow-up. There are obviously, you have brethren and sisters around the country who are local lawmakers. What are you hearing from your colleagues in other parts of the country about this issue of defunding or divesting from the police?
Well, certainly it's not a monolith, but what you're hearing from particularly progressive people of color and allies across the country, younger lawmakers and newer lawmakers alike, is this kind of shared focus on finding ways to really reduce crime, reduce unnecessary interactions with law enforcement. So we are all really trying to figure it out at the same time. We're comparing notes and trying to figure it out. And I think if all of us are doing our jobs and doing our jobs well, our police agencies included, we're going to see a reduction in the size of police forces within the next 5 years, but it has to be replaced with something, and people still want to feel safe. So we are really charged with making sure that they are, that any effort we undertake is results oriented.
Vendetta, as the person on this panel who has been a former police officer, what does, how can I say it, what does model policing look like to you? Because as we're talking about defunding or changing what policing looks like, you are someone who has been on the front lines. If you had a magic wand and you could make policing look the way you wanted, how would it look? And how would that fit into some of the concerns you are now hearing addressed by community members and grassroots activists across the country about what they're saying they need and want from their police forces?
I think a model police department would be one that the community designs. So a police department, and even in this conversation of how do you reform a police agency, it should be a vision of the city's leadership, and that vision should be collected from its stakeholders. So, you know, you have to include your community members, you have to include your police department, your activists, your judges, attorneys, but your, you know, your visitors. You have to include a wide net of stakeholders and get them together and let them tell you how they want to be policed, how they want to interact, or how, you know, what type of interactions they believe is appropriate with the police department. And from that information, your leaders design a police department that's responsive to what the community has said. And I think right now, what we're seeing from the community is a message of what they want from the police department. And I think we should listen. So a model police department is always going to be one that's reflective of what the community says it wants. You can't go to a community and police them how you want them to be policed. You should always be policing how they want to be policed.
Now, I want to follow up on that with you, Martinez, because a part of this conversation is the police, but that's not where the conversation ends. It really is about all of the stakeholders that are part of the criminal justice system. And you, having served as a former prosecutor, know that prosecutors are a key part of that. How do prosecutors play a role right now, or what should their role be as we're talking about reforming how policing is done in this country? You know, I will tell you, I spent my first summer out of law school as an intern at the Manhattan DA's office when Robert Morgenthau was the DA in Manhattan. And I remember so many people said, you want to be Mrs. Civil Rights. How can you go to the prosecutor's office? And I told them that one of the things I learned early on was how much power prosecutors had. And that if we wanted to make real change within the justice system, we had to be working from the inside out and the outside in. And that was one of the reasons very early on in my career, I thought there was value in being inside of the prosecutor's office. But tell us from your perspective what the role of prosecutors is at this moment as we try to figure out how to bring about the reforms that Vendetta has just said people in the community are saying they want to see.
Yeah, thank you for that, Nicole. I think number one, as a prosecutor, the primary thing that you need to focus on is having empathy for the communities that you're serving. Try to put yourselves in the shoes of not only your victims, but also your defendants. And if you can't see the person that you're prosecuting or the victim that you're helping as your brother or your sister or your family member or your friend, it's going to be very difficult for you to mete out justice effectively and fairly if for whatever reason, maybe because they don't come from a similar background, they don't look like you, or they don't share the same belief system, you know, you don't have any empathy for them. So that's number one. I think number two, you have to balance your need for moving up in the office with what's actually fair and just. Because a lot of times as a prosecutor, winning cases is how you move up, especially tough cases. But a lot of times the just thing to do is actually plead out the case. But it's highly unlikely that you're going to get any rewards for pleading out a bunch of cases, even though that's the just thing to do. So sometimes it requires you to kind of let go of your ego, put your own personal desires aside, and do what's really in the best interest of the community. And sometimes that can be a very, very difficult thing to do.
So Paige, I want to go back to you. Given what you've heard your fellow panelists say, if we were to change how policing looks in this country, and if we were to be more responsive to what we hear people in the streets saying they want, what would policing then look like? Would we have fewer bodies serving in the role of police officer? Would our police agencies take on new roles and duties? You know, there's a lot of discussion, as you said at the beginning, about the needs of the community. There are mental health needs, there are healthcare needs, there are housing needs, education needs, transportation needs. These are all the things we at Human Rights Watch are saying we need to be focusing on as well. So if we want to focus on those things, what does that then mean for the future of what police agencies look like? How will they metamorphose into something different than what they have historically been? And we know historically, we got to go back. We got to go back 401 years. We got to go back to slave patrols. I mean, we know that the engendering of policing in this country started then. It started with the first slave ship that came to the United States. So we've had 401 years of developing this system. How does it look once it's changed?
Yeah, you know, I just want to echo that it really should be responsive to community needs. But I like to think, you know, less about reimagining the role of policing, but reimagining what we're thinking about when we talk about safety. What does safety really mean to communities? How do communities feel safe? And the reason I like to talk about that is because, you know, crime is not random. And most of the time that crime happens is when somebody can't meet their basic needs, and not just their economic needs, which is why it's so important when we're talking about defunding, divestment, that we talk about and emphasize the reinvestment portion of that, reinvesting on the front end, investing in housing, education, and healthcare, so people don't have to rely on criminalized behaviors. I also like to touch on the fact that crime is a social construct, you know? Current law creates mass criminalization of poverty, substance use, LGBTQ status, disability status, particularly as it relates to mental health illnesses and immigration status. And so a lot of the laws that we implement in this country really make it illegal to do very few things when you're a marginalized person in society. And then I think the final point that I want to make is I'm not certain people understand what policing looks like now. And I say that because out of the 10.3 million arrests made every year by police, only 5% of those arrests are for the most serious offenses, for rape, murder, and aggravated assault. So 95% of the arrests made every year are for minor petty offenses, things that have been unnecessarily criminalized, in many cases have led to the murder of Black people at the hands of police. And so really we need to think about reducing the role. Police are really only spending 5% of their time investigating and solving serious crimes. We need a serious reduction in their role and their presence. We need smaller police forces, and we need investment in services with trained professionals like social workers, counselors, teachers, psychiatrists, and psychologists who are equipped to respond to the needs of community and the safety of the community that's not punitive.
So former Officer Parker, Paige just said to us, she wonders if people really understand what policing looks like now. You know, I'm sure that like many of you, you have been peppered with questions since Sunday, seeing the videotape of Brother Jacob Blake in Wisconsin being shot in the back in Kenosha, Wisconsin, you've been peppered with questions similar to ones I've gotten. And I will tell you, one of the key ones I've gotten is, wasn't he trying to break up a fight? Why were the police involved in someone ostensibly serving as a good Samaritan trying to break up a fight? So Paige just said people don't understand what policing actually looks like and what they deal with. Help us to understand what role they really play. If as Paige says, the largest percentage of their time is not spent on serious quote unquote crimes, help us understand what policing looks like and why are police involved in issues such as being in communities when fights are being broken up. Help us to understand that.
Well, the direct answer to why we're there if a fight is being broken up is probably because someone called the police for them to respond. But it is important to understand our role of police as we're deciding what we want that to be. And one important thing that I want to bring out, and I'm not familiar with how agencies work elsewhere, but here in our city, when we're ready to make a decision on what we want the police department to do or not do, when we're ready for other agencies to take the lead on social issues like addiction or mental health or child welfare, those type of issues, those agencies also have to understand their role in police reform. I don't think a lot of people understand that many of the calls that the police respond to for folks in mental crisis or for folks who are under the influence of some type of illegal substance, those calls come from the very agencies that are responsible for handling those situations. We often get calls for, I'm not there anymore, but they get calls for child welfare checks, or they get called for mental health, person in mental health crises who's walking into the street or who's yelling at other citizens. We get calls that are inappropriate for MPD, for the police. But a lot of them come from the very agencies that should be handling that. And I think a broader conversation needs to be had with those agencies so that they understand their role in police reform. When these funds, and I think reallocating funds to the other agencies are completely appropriate. But when these funds are reallocated to those agencies, they have to build capacity. They have to have their staffing during the hours where they're needed and not during the convenient hours for the employee. They have to be able to come out at night, in the middle of the night, or in the wee hours of the morning when they're needed the most. And they can't be afraid of the people that they serve. They can't say, well, I'm not going to that neighborhood unless a police officer accompanies me. Because then you have the police back involved in a situation we shouldn't be involved. So I think that before we move towards reallocating funds or dropping off certain responsibilities of the police department, we have to make sure that these other agencies are clear and they understand their role, that they must respond, that they can't rely on the police department to go and handle those situations on their behalf.
So Councilmember White, I guess this means we look to you as a local legislator. You heard Officer Parker say, what the roles of other agencies are. How do you balance making sure that you're meeting the needs of law enforcement, but also making sure that you're meeting the needs of the other requisite agencies whose services and support are so very much needed by the community? We at Human Rights Watch did a major report on policing in Tulsa. And one of the findings that we had was, in talking to council members there, was that when they had to put together their budget, one of the things that the community criticized them for was taking away money from public transportation to allocate it to police. When the community members said what we most need are our city buses, so that those of us without cars can get to work, can keep jobs that allow us to pay for our children's health care, their housing, put food in their bellies, and clothes on their backs. How do you as a local legislator balance those needs to ensure that you're not disarming, no pun intended, your police agency, but to also ensure that you're strengthening the other agencies that, again, the community members are saying they need their support so gravely?
So it's a great question. And so I think what we have to do is switch from a lens of rebalancing to a lens of restructuring. So everybody who is in elected office anywhere in the United States was elected into in a pre-existing criminal justice system where the response for almost anything is going to their police departments. And so we can switch funding to increase funding for our mental health agencies. But if those agencies don't have the capacity, to Vendetta's point, they're just going to call the police. And so what we really have to do is start to restructure. And that is something that's going to take a lot of work. It's ideally going to require the cooperation, or at least it would work better if we had the cooperation of our law enforcement agencies and our mental health and social services agencies to understand what responses to these types of incidents would look like. Right now, the folks who know best what skill sets are needed are our police departments, because those are the folks that, to this point, are called to address these issues. So if we really start to have significant conversations with our law enforcement departments to say, okay, what skill sets and tools do we need to equip other agencies with for them to be able to respond? But then our dispatch services have to be able to contact more than fire, emergency medical services, and police. They have to be able to contact mental health services or domestic violence specialists. So what we really have to do is a restructuring. And I know myself and several legislators across the country are very interested in that and really starting research to understand what that might look like.
So Paige, Councilmember White said there are local legislators who are starting to examine what that looks like. You at the ACLU have been engaged in a lot of research and advocacy and reform work around this issue. Can you give us some examples of what success looks like in some jurisdictions across the country? Are there some jurisdictions that, in your estimation, are getting it right?
I wouldn't go as far to say that I believe any jurisdictions are getting it right. I think that there are jurisdictions who are on the way to getting it right. But this is a long process, right? Like, this isn't going to happen overnight. We're not going to be able to rethink policing and reimagine public safety overnight. But there are jurisdictions that have implemented really important programs that have been successful and can be emulated in other cities. One of the ones I like to point to is Cahoots, which is a program in Eugene, Oregon that's operated by the Whitebird Clinic. And it dispatches two-person teams of medics and crisis workers instead of law enforcement to emergency calls involving severe behavioral health crises. Not only do these teams provide immediate stabilization support to individuals experiencing medical or psychological crises, they also offer broad wraparound services, including crisis counseling, suicide prevention and intervention, conflict resolution and mediation, substance abuse treatment, and housing support. I mean, it's a really wraparound service program. In 2019, that team handled nearly 1 in 5 of the 911 calls that they received in Eugene, Oregon. And they only had to request police backup a couple of times. And this saved the county $14 million in ambulance and emergency hospitalization costs alone. So I think that's a really important program to point to. But I think there are other jurisdictions that are moving in that direction, right? We have Minneapolis, where the city council voted unanimously to disband the Minneapolis Police Department and recreate a Department of Community Safety and Violence Prevention. And I love that framing, that the focus is really on community safety and violence prevention, and law enforcement will be a part of that. but there's so many different aspects to it. And the Minneapolis City Council recognizes that safety is not just law enforcement, right? Because law enforcement isn't prevention. Law enforcement often comes in after the fact, after a harm has been committed. So how do we stop it on the front end? There are cities like LA that cut budgets by $150 million and have ballot initiatives in November to redirect funding to community-based services. There are jurisdictions that are trying to and developing good programs, but I don't think any jurisdiction has got it right yet.
Officer Parker, you mentioned earlier that oftentimes it is other corresponding agencies within a local government that call on the police to respond to certain needs, whether they be mental health needs, housing needs, needs around homelessness. But help us to understand, if people in the community do not have law enforcement to turn to, how do they know what their other options are? And are there other options that are as responsive, as immediate as community members need, that they can turn to? I know for some people, during some talks that I've had, people say it's, that old saying, it's 6 in one, half dozen of the other. They'll say, I don't want to call the police, but I don't know what other options I have. I don't know that I have an option to call a mental health provider within my county healthcare system who can show up at my house when my autistic son, for instance, is having an episode and I can't help him or her. So I feel that my only option is the police. How do people in the community know what other options are at their disposal?
So how they know is by those agencies making their services known. The police department has community meetings every month, depending on where your area is. Some have 2. They have a commander's meeting that's once a month, and then the area manager has a meeting that's once a month. And we advertise. We go out and we let people know when our meeting is, and we give out crime stats, we give out safety information, we advertise our community events. We make an effort to let people know that we're there. I think these other agencies could probably make the same effort. I'm not, saying that they may need to have a monthly meeting, but they do need to make more of an effort of letting the residents or citizens in the city know what they offer and what's available, and what services they can provide. If they're not advertising what they do, there's no way for anyone to know that that's the agency that they're supposed to call. And there are some resources that are available when someone is in crisis. The Department of Behavioral Health has a mobile crisis team. And this team they don't work 24 hours, but I think they work 20 hours out of the day. And they're a very good team. What's unfortunate is that there's just one team. And that one team can't be all over the city at once. One thing that can be done for them with a reallocation of funds is they can build capacity and perhaps have a mobile team available in each ward, or at least have a team that may be responsible for no more than 2 wards to increase their rapid response to a person who's in mental health crisis. The city also has a great domestic violence hotline. They have an organization that provides immediate service to anyone who's having a domestic violence situation where they're in danger. They need, emergency housing, or they need emergency legal services, maybe someone to help them through custody papers or, a restraining order. Those services are available, and it's just unfortunate that they're not widely known. And they're 24 hours, 7 days a week. So, there are services there. It's just the agencies that are in charge of those services need to do a better job of advertising.
Martinez, I'm gonna shift our conversation a little bit. One could argue that as good and as rich as this conversation is, that it's one in which we're preaching to the choir. How do we get to those communities and those people who don't necessarily think that anything at all, not even a little hair on the chin of policing in this country needs to change. You know, we know that all great movements historically in the United States don't just happen because certain sects of the community want change. We know that we've seen change because large swaths of the community come to some agreement that we need to see change. How do we engage those people who say, you know, I like what the police do. I think they keep my community safe. My property values are high because they keep it safe and they keep people out who I don't want to be here. They keep people out who I think should be staying on the other side of the tracks. What do we do about those people? And how do we overcome some of those differences in thinking so that we can have a real nationwide conversation on police reform?
That's a really really difficult question. I think until people look at others and see themselves, I think this goes back to the initial statement that I made about empathy. I mean, we have to do a better job in educating people to understand that helping one group of people in the criminal justice system is going to help everybody. And until we can shift that belief system, until we can convince people that it's not a zero-sum game, that that look, helping one community is not going to harm you, then I'm gonna be honest with you. I think it's I honestly don't have the answer to that right now, and I think there are a number of things that we can do though. I think we can keep bringing awareness to the issues like we are doing today. I think the constant video footage that we're seeing of people being murdered by police has brought out people of all colors, all races to protest. So I think that people are waking up, and I think all that we can do is continue to bring awareness to it.
Paige, how do we, hearing what Martinez said, how do we keep the momentum going? People are asking me all the time, is this just a blip on the screen of history? Because, you know, there are some people who said we've had incidences before.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is, you know, in the policing advocacy space, we often talk about this cycle of police harm and reform. And it usually starts with a very public incident like the murder of George Floyd or the attempted murder of Jacob Blake. And then people are in the streets demanding change, politicians and sometimes implement some reforms, and people get back to their normal lives. And it's a cycle, and we see it every few years or every few months, depending on the year. I think what's important now is that we continue to educate people, right? Especially around the importance of divestment and more transformational reforms. I think, you know, the question you were asking earlier, how do we bring people in? How do we tell people? Is really interesting. It's something that the ACLU is engaging in right now, is reaching out to our membership base and having deep organizing calls with them, talking to them. What does divestment mean to you? Why do you support it? Why don't you support it? Talking about the legacy of policing, where it stems from, and why it is so harmful. I think that's really the key, is that public education piece. And something I just want to touch on, you know, is when we often talk about policing, and there are people who do say, I do feel like communities or the police keep my community safe. But I often like to point to, you know, white suburban neighborhoods that are pretty wealthy. And, you know, people are like, oh, well, defunding the police is so outrageous or so radical. But you look at these communities, these wealthy white suburban communities, and the type of world we're envisioning for communities of color, low-income communities, are just those worlds where police aren't constantly harassing you. They aren't there when you don't call for them to be there. They aren't going to murder you when you do encounter them. You know, that's what we're demanding. And so I think bringing people into the fold and telling them that, and really teaching them about policing and divestment, that this isn't some big, scary, radical thing. This is talking about caring for communities, investing in life-affirming programs so everyone has the opportunity to thrive, is really important now.
Officer Parker, can we get to that? I'm going to call it this page. Can we get to that utopia, Officer Parker, that Paige has just laid out so lovely for us. You know, I remember, I'm aging, I'm gonna date myself here, but when I was a little girl, I remember police officers used to come in for like the show and tell periods, and we used to call them officer friendly. And we were taught they were our friends, we could trust them, they were here to protect us. So what Paige just described are having communities where people feel like the police are only going to be here when I need them and to help me. Otherwise, they're not going to tread on my waters, which is what everybody wants. People just want to be able to live in peace. Can we get to that?
I think you can. And I think if you look, I mean, we're obviously not there today. But I think if you look over history, there have been changes in how we police. Like you said, we started with slave patrols when the goal was catch, contain, and control. And we moved past that, and we've gotten, you know, not much better, but you had dogs and water hoses and other things, and you know, that wasn't acceptable. It came a time when that no longer was acceptable in policing, and we stopped. But we've moved and shifted to the police brutality, the excessive force, the shootings out of fear, and a lot of other unacceptable, sorry, it's lightning here, sorry. A lot of other unacceptable behaviors by police officers. And I think I kind of go back to what I was saying in the beginning. The leadership of you know, the folks in charge of police departments, our mayors, our city councils, our governors, they have to come up with a vision of what they want their police departments to be, how they want them to operate, how they want them to respond to their citizens. And they can start to build that vision by speaking to the stakeholders, everyone who's involved or everyone that the police touch in some way. And once they decide on that vision, you choose a leader who matches your vision. If your leader, if your chief is not aligned with the values of your community, you're not going to reach the vision that you've designed for your police department. And a police department is no less than any other business. Before you start a business, you come up with a plan. This is how I want to run my business. This is how I want it to operate. This is the product I want to give my clients. You have to come up with that framework and put that foundation together first, and then you choose your person that's going to run your business or your police department. That person will be responsible for implementing your vision. But you have to make sure you have that right person first, you know, and you get that right person and they'll spread your vision amongst their workers. And theoretically, you should have a police department that's responding to the community the way they wish to be responded to. So I think you can get there, but there's some work that needs to be put into the process of designing your police department to be that type of police department.
Okay. I want to make sure that we leave time to get questions from our audience participants, our virtual audience participants. And I've been trying to weave those in along the way. I've been looking at monitoring the chat, but I want to make sure we get to more of them. But before I do that, I'm going to give you all just 30 seconds to answer this question. And right now I'm invoking the spirit of one of my heroes and mentors, the late Congressman John Lewis, as we are on the eve of the anniversary of the March on Washington. That's approaching this Friday, the 28th. And as you all recall, he was one of the speakers. He was actually the last surviving speaker until his death of that historic 1963 march. If each of you were going to be on stage at the Lincoln Memorial this Friday at this march, given the critical moment that we are in history, given this discussion around policing, around abuse, around systemic racism, give me in 30 seconds what would be the key point you would want to make to all of the people who are going to be standing out with their masks on at that march, listening to you. And I'm going to start with you, Councilmember White. What would you say?
I would use the words of my personal hero, Frederick Douglass: agitate, agitate, agitate. As much as people might believe that just showing up or marching doesn't make a difference, if you watch the DNC convention, you realize that you have shifted the party with your action. So keep pushing, because laws don't get passed unless people push, and keep pushing. And I can't make the changes that I want to make, that people want us to make, unless people are on the streets pushing.
Thank you. Paige, what would you say in your 30 seconds?
I would remind people of the amount of power they have on the local municipal level, right? So much of the work we're demanding right now, the divestment, defunding work, happens on the local level, and people really need to harness their power on that level, talk to their city council members, talk to their mayors, talk to their community. The only way we're going to achieve transformational change is through community organizing. And that's where we need to focus, on this local community level.
Martinez, what say you in your 30 seconds?
I was told that you're in, you can affect change, whether it's educating your voting or whatever it is, do something.
And Officer Parker, you get the last word. What would you say in front of the Lincoln Memorial in your 30 seconds?
I actually was going to say protest, but the council member kind of about that. So I'm going to say get involved, which is also a form of protest. And I'm going to also say, don't accept the first answer. When you're pushing for change and you're pushing for transparency and you're pushing for answers, don't accept the first answer that you're given by your officials. Give a follow-up question. Have them dig a little deeper and give you more of a response regarding what they're doing. The first answer is always a shell answer, just to get past that question. Have a follow-up question and force them to dig deeper and give you more information. Force transparency.
So, Officer Parker, I'm going to stick with you for a second because I'm looking at the questions in our chat, and I want to pose one to you. But I also know, Deanna and Tony, that I believe someone on our committee is collecting questions for me. So just let me know if we have others. But in the meantime, I will look at what people have put up, because we, again, want to make sure that we hear from our participants. So Officer Parker, one of the questions is, as a former officer, were you trained in any form of de-escalation tactics in terms of dealing with the Black community, or were you only trained to pull out your gun at the very last minute? I think that's a critical question. I have a colleague whose husband is a police officer, and I remember in a discussion that he and I had one time, he said, because I asked him a similar question. He said, we're not trained at the academy to de-escalate. We're trained at the academy to pull out, when we pull out that gun, to shoot to kill. Because I said, well, what about shooting people, in the kneecap if you have to shoot, or just grazing a shoulder just to scare them and get people to stop? What about that? So tell us about some of the training and whether the training is counter to some of the principles for reform that we've been talking about tonight.
A lot to unpack there. So we're not trained to shoot to kill. We're trained to incapacitate, to stop the threat. We're not trained to shoot in kneecaps and hands and elbows or shoulders, because when you're under stress, that's too minute to aim at. So it's, the data shows that we're not good shots on a normal day. And when you're under stress, you just can't aim for body parts that are that small. So we aim for center mass because that's the largest part of your body, but we're not trained to kill. We're trained to stop the threat. The de-escalation, police departments do a great job of classroom de-escalation training. And by that, I mean, when we go into a classroom, we have somebody who's certified or who's an expert in de-escalation, and they give us classroom instruction. Where that goes wrong is that when officers go to defensive tactics training, we don't incorporate de-escalation into defensive tactics training. So everything that's taught in that classroom goes out the window when an officer is in a stressful situation. So when he's confronting someone that he fears may cause him or someone else harm, he's reverting back to the training he received in defensive tactics training. And if you're not incorporating de-escalation into that, there's no part of de-escalation that's going to transfer to his response to a stressful situation on the street when encountered. So officers, modern officers, do get de-escalation training. It just needs to be broadened. And I think one way of doing that is to involve Department of Corrections. So, you know, correction officers work inside of a confined location. They're not allowed to have weapons. They're not allowed to have guns or any type of deadly weapon. Yet, they're able to keep calm a large population of people without weapons. That's a lot of de-escalation training. I think that police departments would be served greatly to have someone from corrections incorporate, at least partly in the defensive tactics training we receive, how to de-escalate those type of stressful situations without having to go to a weapon. And the last thing I want to say on that is there's no amount of training that's going to rid officers of fear. And what we're seeing across the country in these responses to young Black men and women is fear. You know, in some of the videos, you can see officers already have their guns out before there's even been any type of encounter. But we don't pull our guns out unless we have a fear that we're going to be harmed. So there's no way to train fear out of a person. I think that's something that police departments are going to have to look at the hiring level. Because if a person is afraid of everyone, of the community that they serve, if they're afraid of the people that they encounter, this is going to be the response repeatedly.
I'm going to ask, to follow up on that, a question to the council member, because I see a couple things coming up in the chat about, about community members turning to other alternatives beyond the police, besides the police. And particularly as I listen to Officer Parker talk about, limitations around training and how police preparedness. I think that takes us back to, other agencies and what kinds of support they can provide. Council member, how do we ensure that community members actually trust? That's a word we haven't really talked about tonight. But how do we ensure that community members actually trust the other options that may be available to them? We talked earlier about the fact that, Officer Parker said, well, some of these other agencies need to make it known that they are available and what kinds of services they provide. But do we have an issue around trust for people in the community such that they're not trusting the police, nor are they trusting some of the other agencies that may be there who can provide alternatives to resolutions for them beyond the police?
So aside from the police response, I don't think it's an issue of trust as much as it is an issue of access. So, a friend of mine reached out several weeks ago and said, hey, I see somebody outside having a mental health kind of crisis. I asked someone who I should call, and they said, you should call the police because that's the only entity that realistically is going to respond to that. And that was an unfortunate realization for me. And, I doubled back to understand, if you call our police dispatch, can you get somebody other than, police, fire, or EMS? And you can't. And that's why I mentioned earlier that this requires really a restructuring. So if agencies were truly equipped to intervene in appropriate circumstances, and they did that credibly, I think that it would be met with great appreciation from the community and also build a lot of trust. But I also think it would help build trust within our police department, because if you didn't see police responding to so many nonviolent incidents, we would not see so many negative interactions that really breed the mistrust and distrust. The other thing, though, is, I think whole departments, not just individual officers, have to create a much higher level of sensitivity to the reason why people of color and communities of color are so distrustful. A lot of officers say, well, I've never, done anything negative, or, I have a great department, therefore, I don't understand why, or I don't accept that people are distrustful. That is a fact of the matter, that many people of color and communities of color don't trust the police. So then rather than arguing about whether that's true, our police departments need to work on healing that. And frankly, our entire government needs to work on addressing that.
Paige, I'm going to go back to you for this next, and I fear it's going to be our last question. I used a little bit of moderator's privilege to take us a little overtime because we started a little bit late, but as with all these conversations, I know we could go on for hours, but we have to let people go and eat dinner and do all the other important things that they have to do. But Paige, this question. You talked at the very onset of the conversation about the difference between the words defund and divest. So one of the questions is changing the language a key part of us successfully dealing with this issue? Should we do away with the term defund as we're talking about the police and really switch to the mindset and the characterization of what we need to do as divest? You know, at Human Rights Watch, we use the phraseology divest and reinvest for that very reason. But what are your thoughts about that? One of our audience members wants to know.
I think it depends on your ideology. I think it is important, if you're an abolitionist, to use that defund language. That is a word that came out of and was born out of the abolitionist movement, which is an unapologetic movement. And they have brilliant ideas. I mean, there are so many brilliant Black women who've been talking about and working on abolition for years. Miriam Kaba, Andrea Ritchie, Angela Davis, Ruth Wilson Gilmore. I mean, the list goes on. And I don't think it's fair to water down their ask. Their ask is to defund the police and abolish the police. And there are very legitimate parts of that ask. I think it's important that they're able to own that language. I think for other folks who don't believe in completely abolishing the police, then they can embrace that divestment language. But I think what's at the core of it is really getting down to, what do we mean, right? Exactly what this conversation was. What do we mean when we say defunding and divest? And I think that's why it's so important that we work on public education, because people just see these slogans, defund the police. We need to teach them what that means. We need to teach them what divestment means and why these things are important, so people don't run away afraid from them.
Thank you. So I see that the people in our audience are cheating, because I know y'all heard me say we got to wrap it up, but y'all are still asking questions. So here's what I'm going to do, because I hate when people's questions don't get answered. I'm going to try to combine the last two that I've seen, okay? And Martinez, I'm going to turn it to you to close it out. And I think, given your prior role as a prosecutor, you're probably very familiar with thinking about this issue. And that's the whole issue of racism. And that many people believe we have officers who are just inherently racist. You know, how do you deal with a system wherein the people who are charged with upholding law and order have biases? And you know, we can have lots of conversations about implicit bias and the Harvard test, because we all have implicit biases. But there is a sense and a concern that people who are racist, a la Bull Connor, you know, Birmingham police chief in the early 1960s, that there are people just like that who are still peppered throughout our police agencies. How do we deal with this issue of racism? And what about all of the principles around 21st century policing that President Obama, during his administration, rolled out and laid out? They gave us a playbook. What about that playbook?
I'll do my best here. I think there needs to be a better screening process, for sure, for police officers who hold those biases, right? You have academies that only last about a year. And if you think about it, doctors, lawyers have to go through years and years of training before they can do the jobs that they're trained to do. Before a doctor can save a life, he or she may have to go through training for 10 years. A police officer in some jurisdictions may not even have to have graduated college, right? So there has to be more training involved to root out those bad apples. I think number two, there has to be more accountability. I think that there should be a database of police officers with police misconduct. If you look in DC, it's very difficult to get internal information about police officers who have committed misconduct. I also think that there needs to be a shift in this notion of shielding police from accountability in civil suits, qualified immunity, right? So we need the politicians to either abolish qualified immunity or severely limit it. And I think as far as 21st century policing, I think that I'll just sum it up and say we all need to go to the polls and make sure that we vote.
On that note, Martinez, thank you. Thank you, Officer Parker. Thank you, Councilmember White. Thank you, Paige, my sister in advocacy and the national organization. You all have been amazing. This has been a rich conversation. This will not be the end. You all know we got a lot of work to do. So eat your Wheaties, get your sleep, do what you got to do. We're in this for the long haul. But I think at the end of the day, again, going back to my hero, Congressman Lewis, my goal and my hope, and I think the hope for all of us is that we someday will see the beloved community. And so with that, I'm going to turn it back over to our colleague, Alexandra. Lexi, please give us closing remarks and bid everyone farewell.
Thank you, Nicole. And I would like to also thank my co-hosts, Tony Towns, Onika Williams, and Deanna Lewis for helping to put on this program. And of course, the panelists who provided great information and perspectives. As you can see from the comment section, everyone has enjoyed this discussion thoroughly. And as I mentioned earlier, that this is a 3-part series. So please tune in for the next discussion. As Nicole mentioned, this is not the end, right? And so this is a continued conversation, and following the conversation are actions. And so we would like to continue to invite you to our panel discussions and to be engaged in this very important conversation. So thank you all. Thank you to the participants and attendees for joining in tonight's conversation.